In 1998, 3 children disappeared from their locked home in Willow Creek, Oregon, while their father was away for less than 90 minutes. No forced entry, no witnesses, no ransom demand. Just 3 kids, ages 12, 10, and 7, gone without a trace, and a front door that was still locked from the inside when he came home. But 25 years later, a demolition crew tears open a wall in an abandoned theater 2 blocks from that house and finds something that proves the children never left Willow Creek at all. They were there the whole time, and someone in this town knew it. The last normal Saturday in Willow Creek smelled like pine sap and rain. That was what Mark Carter remembered most when he talked about it later. Not the faces of his children at breakfast, not the sound of the television in the living room, not even the particular quality of October light coming through the kitchen window. He remembered the smell, pine sap and rain, the way the whole Willow Valley exhaled after a storm, clean and cold and impossibly alive. He was standing at the counter making coffee when he noticed the screen on the back door was loose again, the same corner he'd meant to fix for 3 weekends running. He made a mental note again and forgot it again. At the time, it seemed like the least significant thing in the world. Willow Creek, Oregon, October 3, 1998. Population 4,211. The kind of town where the diner on Main Street had been run by the same family since 1967, where the high school football coach was also the history teacher and the assistant fire marshal, where people left their cars unlocked in their own driveways and considered it a minor scandal if someone didn't wave back from their porch. The Douglas firs crowded the hills on every side, pressing the town into the valley like something cupped in giant hands. In summer, tourists drove through on their way to the coast. In fall, the town became its own closed world, the logging roads turning soft with mud, the fog settling into the streets each morning and refusing to leave until almost noon. Mark Carter was 32 years old that October. He worked as a site manager for a regional construction company based out of Eugene, which meant he drove into the valley 5 days a week and spent his weekends catching up on everything a house with 3 children required. He was broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and remembered everyone's coffee order. His wife, Carol, taught 2nd grade at Willow Creek Elementary. Their children were Emma, 12, Lily, 10, and Noah, 7. That Saturday morning, Carol had left early for her mother's house in Medford, a 3-hour drive south. A routine visit planned for weeks. She'd kissed all 3 children goodbye while they were still half asleep, kissed Mark in the kitchen, and driven away in the gray, pre-dawn light. Mark had watched her taillights disappear around the bend on Sycamore Street and felt the comfortable weight of a day at home with his kids settling over him. Nothing pressing, nothing urgent, just the pleasant, low-level chaos of a Saturday with Emma, Lily, and Noah. By mid-morning, they'd eaten pancakes and argued mildly about what movie to watch. Noah had dragged his collection of toy trucks into the living room and constructed an elaborate traffic system across the carpet. Lily had retreated to the kitchen table with her blue spiral notebook, the one she carried everywhere, writing something she declined to share with anyone. Emma, asserting the quiet authority of the oldest child, had claimed the remote and put on a documentary about deep-sea creatures that nobody else wanted to watch, but nobody was willing to fight her about. Mark told them he was going to the hardware store for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. He needed weather stripping for the garage door, the kind that came in a specific width he'd checked twice that morning. He told Emma she was in charge. He told Noah to stop using the couch cushions as ramps for his trucks. He told Lily to eat something before lunch, not after. He kissed the top of her head. She was bent over her notebook and didn't look up, just made a small sound that he chose to interpret as acknowledgement. He drove to Whitmore's Hardware on 3rd Street, spent longer than he intended comparing weather stripping options with Dale Whitmore's youngest son, who had opinions about adhesive backing that Mark hadn't asked for. He bought the weather stripping and a box of wood screws he didn't strictly need, and a bottle of deck sealant he kept forgetting. He stopped at the gas station for a coffee. He drove back through downtown, past the old Riverside Theater with its marquee letters missing and its facade darkened by years of Oregon weather, past the diner where someone had propped the door open despite the cold, past the elementary school sitting empty and wide-eyed on a Saturday, and he turned onto Sycamore Street and parked in his own driveway at 12:47 in the afternoon. The front door was still locked from the inside. He used his key. The television was on in the living room, the deep-sea documentary replaced at some point by a cartoon, its bright colors filling the empty room. Noah's trucks were arranged in their traffic system across the carpet, but Noah wasn't there. Lily's notebook was open on the kitchen table beside an untouched glass of orange juice. Emma's jacket was on its hook by the door. All 3 backpacks were in their rooms. The back door was locked. Every window was locked. Mark called their names. He checked every room. He checked the basement and the attic and the backyard and the narrow strip of garden along the fence. He called Carol's cell phone, and when she answered, he said the words out loud for the first time. The words that would define the next 25 years of his life. "The kids are gone," he said. "Carol, the kids are gone, and I don't understand." The doors were locked. He was still holding Lily's blue spiral notebook when the first patrol car arrived. He hadn't meant to pick it up. He hadn't even realized he was holding it until Officer Ray Dunning gently took it from his hands as evidence, and Mark felt the absence of it in his grip, like something pulled from a wound. The investigation of the Carter children's disappearance became the consuming fact of Willow Creek for the months that followed, and then for the years, and then for the long, quiet decades during which it never fully resolved, but ceased to generate new information, and settled instead into the particular grief of things that cannot be finished. Deputy Detective James Harlow of the Douglas County Sheriff's Office led the initial investigation. He was methodical and experienced, and he had seen difficult cases before. But he would say privately to colleagues, years later, that the Carter case was the one that stayed with him, not because of what they found, but because of what they couldn't find. Every window secured from the inside. Both exterior doors locked, the deadbolt on the front engaged, the chain lock on the back latched at a height that 7-year-old Noah couldn't have reached. The screen on the back door was loose at one corner, but the door itself was locked. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, no footprints in the soft ground around the house beyond those belonging to the family. It was, Harlow wrote in his notes on the 3rd day, as if the children had simply ceased to exist inside the house. The FBI sent 2 agents from Portland. Search parties covered the hills and the valley floor and the banks of the Willow River for 3 weeks. Cadaver dogs worked the logging roads. Divers searched the reservoir outside town. The national media arrived, spent 4 days, and moved on when the story refused to develop new details. Carol Carter sat in front of cameras with red-rimmed eyes and said her children's names over and over, asking anyone with information to come forward. Mark stood beside her and said nothing, because he had discovered that when he opened his mouth to speak about his children, what came out was not words, but something that frightened him, a sound he didn't recognize as belonging to himself. In the first months, leads arrived from across the state and beyond. Reported sightings, anonymous calls, letters from people who claimed to have information and had none. Each one was investigated. each one led nowhere. The case file grew thick, and then thicker, and then was transferred to the cold case unit of the Oregon State Police in 2001, where it was assigned a case number and a shelf, and the occasional review that cold cases received, which was to say, not enough. Mark Carter did not move away from Willow Creek. People asked him why, over the years, gently and then less gently. Carol had left in 2003, not because she stopped loving him, but because she could not continue to live inside the house where her children had last been alive, and Mark could not consider leaving it. He understood why she went. He did not try to stop her. He stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, though he could not have explained exactly who he would have been abandoning. He fixed the loose screen on the back door in the spring of 1999. He kept the children's rooms as they were for 5 years, and then slowly changed them without being able to identify the moment he decided to do so. He kept one thing unchanged. Lily's blue notebook never left the house after they returned it to him in 2001, when the FBI formally transferred the case. He kept it in the kitchen drawer where she'd kept her pencils, wrapped in a clean cloth. He didn't read it. He was not able to explain why he didn't read it, except that reading it felt like a door he couldn't close again once he'd opened it. By 2010, Willow Creek had developed the particular atmosphere of a town that has been the site of tragedy and has learned to live alongside it without resolving it. The Riverside Theater, already in decline when the children disappeared, had been fully closed since 2004, its owner having moved to Portland, and the building sitting in a quiet legal dispute over property taxes and back payments. Children who'd grown up after 1998 told each other stories about it. The building developed the reputation that empty buildings in small towns always develop, becoming a vessel for the fears the town couldn't put somewhere more specific. Parents told their children to stay away from it, and the children stayed away from it, and the building stood on the corner of River Street and 4th Avenue and absorbed years of Oregon rain in silence. Mark Carter was 55 years old and working a desk job for the same construction company when Detective Sarah Miller contacted him for the first time in the spring of 2023. She introduced herself as an investigator with the Oregon State Police Cold Case Division. She said she had been reviewing the Carter file for several weeks. She said she had some questions if he was willing to speak with her. He told her he was always willing. He had been waiting 25 years for someone to call him with questions he hadn't already been asked. They met at his kitchen table. She was 41, compact and steady in the way of someone who carried their energy close to the body rather than projecting it outward. She had dark eyes that moved around a room with the particular patience of someone who believed that rooms told stories if you gave them enough time. She set a yellow legal pad on the table and a pen beside it, and she asked him to describe the house as it had been in October 1998, not the events of that day, just the house, where the furniture was, what the kids used which rooms for, whether any work had been done on the structure recently. Mark answered carefully. He told her about the weather stripping he'd bought that day. He told her about the back door screen. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, because it had never seemed relevant, that the previous autumn a man from the city had come to inspect the utility conduits beneath the house and the properties along that block, something related to old electrical infrastructure from the 1960s that the county had been inventorying. Miller's pen stopped moving. She looked up from her legal pad. "Do you remember his name?" she asked. Mark thought about it. "Brooks," he said. "Something Brooks. He had a city badge. I didn't ask to see it up close." Miller wrote the name down with 3 sharp lines beneath it. She didn't explain why. She capped her pen, thanked him for his time, and drove directly from his house to the Douglas County Records Office, where she spent the next 4 hours requesting documentation on every utility inspection conducted in Willow Creek between 1995 and 1999. She was back at her motel on Route 9 by 9 in the evening. She set the records on the bed and started reading. At 11:43, she found a work order from August 1997, 14 months before the children disappeared, for an inspection and maintenance assessment of the underground electrical conduit network serving the historic district of Willow Creek. The assigned technician was listed as Daniel Brooks, contracted through a company called Pacific Grid Services out of Eugene. Pacific Grid Services had been dissolved in 2001. Its business address was a mail drop. Miller stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the Riverside Theater's current property manager, a real estate holding company in Portland. She told them she needed to know the status of the building's scheduled demolition. They told her it was already underway. The crew had started 3 days ago. Miller was in her car and on the road in 4 minutes. She arrived at the Riverside Theater at 7:14 the next morning. The demolition crew hadn't started yet. 2 men in hard hats were drinking coffee from a thermos beside their truck, and one of them, the site foreman, a heavy-set man named Greg Olin, looked at her badge, and then at her face, and then at her badge again, with the expression of someone who has learned that when state police arrive at your job site before 8 in the morning, the day is going to be unusual. "I need you to stop work," Miller said, "specifically on the interior walls of the ground floor. Has anything been opened up back there yet?" Olin told her they'd started on the lobby ceiling the day before. The ground floor back section, what used to be the projection room and the maintenance corridor behind the stage, was scheduled for today. "Then I'm 3 days lucky," Miller said, and put on a hard hat. The interior of the Riverside Theater had the quality of all long-abandoned places, the smell of damp wood and old upholstery, and something underneath those smells that was harder to name, a kind of suspended time, as though the air itself had been waiting. The lobby floor was covered in a layer of debris from the ceiling work, plaster dust and lath and old insulation. Miller moved carefully through it, her flashlight cutting through the dimness, toward the rear of the building, where the maintenance corridor ran behind the original stage housing. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The walls were plaster over brick, original construction from 1941 when the theater had been built. But halfway down the corridor on the left side, Miller's flashlight caught something that made her stop and hold very still. The plaster was uniform along most of the wall, but in a section approximately 8 feet wide and running from floor to ceiling, the surface was subtly different. Not in color, someone had painted over it, but in texture. The plaster here was slightly smoother, slightly less cracked, applied perhaps a decade later than the surrounding walls. Miller pressed her palm flat against it and felt the difference, the way you feel a scar on skin, a slight wrongness, a place where the surface doesn't quite match itself. She brought Olin back with her. She showed him the section of wall. She watched him look at it with a professional eye for 3 seconds before he said quietly, "That's been replastered. Maybe the 90s? Could be later." "Open it," Miller said. He used a reciprocating saw along the edges of the replastered section, working carefully. It took 22 minutes. When the section came free in pieces and Olin shone his work light through the opening, both of them went silent simultaneously. The hidden room was approximately 7 feet by 9 feet. It had been furnished with deliberate, horrible care. A low cot frame with a disintegrated foam mattress, a folding table, a chemical toilet in the corner, long, dry, and odorless now. On the floor, Dozens of plastic water bottles flattened and aged to near brittleness. The remnants of food wrappers, their labels gone to nothing. 3 sleeping bags, or what had once been sleeping bags, now little more than fiber and memory. Against the far wall, 3 sets of remains. Miller had been in law enforcement for 18 years. She stood in the opening of that room for 63 seconds. She counted, because counting was the only thing keeping her breathing, before she took out her phone. The remains were small. Children's remains. Near one of them, a pair of glasses, the frames intact, but the lenses long gone. Near another, a single canvas shoe. And near the smallest set of remains, nearest the wall, a blue spiral notebook. Miller did not enter the room. She took photographs from the opening. She called the Douglas County Medical Examiner and the Oregon State Police Major Crimes Unit and the FBI Field Office in Portland. And she gave each of them the same address and the same sentence. "I've found the Carter children." Then she called Mark Carter. She gave him 30 seconds of silence on the line after she told him, which was not enough, which would never be enough. And she listened to the sound a man makes when the thing he has dreaded and hoped for and dreaded for 25 years arrives at the same time, arriving as the same thing. Hope and dread colliding in his chest at the exact same moment. "Are they?" he started. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry, Mark." He didn't say anything else for a long time. Then he said, "The blue notebook. Is there a blue notebook?" Miller looked at the notebook through the opening in the wall, barely visible in the dust. "Yes." She heard him breathing. Then she heard something else, a sound like a man setting down a weight he had carried until it had become indistinguishable from his own body. "That's Lily's," he said. "She had it the morning I left." The document examiner was a precise, quiet woman named Dr. Anita Soros, who worked out of the state lab in Salem. She spent 4 days on Lily Carter's notebook using infrared imaging and chemical stabilization before she called Miller with her results. "The first pages are mostly gone," Dr. Soros said. "Water damage and time. But starting at what I believe is the 3rd or 4th day after entry, there are legible sections. I'm sending them to you now." Miller read the recovered text at her motel room table with the door locked and the television off. The first legible entry was dated in a child's handwriting, uncertain about whether it was the 4th or the 5th day. "We are in a room behind a wall. Noah is scared, and Emma keeps telling him it's okay, even though she doesn't know that. There is a man who comes to a little metal door in the wall and pushes water bottles through. He doesn't talk very much. He has a sad voice. Emma asked him to let us out, and he said he couldn't yet. He said he was keeping us safe. I don't know what we need to be kept safe from." The next legible section, perhaps 2 days later. "The man came again. He pushed through bread and more water and something that might be crackers, but they're soft. Emma asked him his name, and he said it doesn't matter. Noah asked if our dad knows where we are. The man didn't answer. He just went away. Emma said we need to stay calm. I'm trying." The entries continued in shorter fragments as the notebook's pages deteriorated, or as Lily's handwriting became less controlled. Miller read each one in order, without stopping, and when she reached the last legible entry, she had to set the papers down and press both hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. The last clear entry read, "The man hasn't come in a long time. Emma says 4 days, but I've lost count. We have almost no water. Noah is sleeping all the time now. Emma sits with him. She doesn't sleep anymore. She gave him almost all of what was left. I can hear Emma sometimes in the night, saying his name very quietly, like she's talking to him, even when he's asleep or not asleep. I wrote all of this down because I want someone to know what happened to us. I want Dad to know we were together. We stayed together the whole time. Below that, in different handwriting, older, more controlled, the hand of a 12-year-old trying to write like an adult. One sentence. We looked for you. We kept looking. Miller sat with those words for a very long time.
She thought about Mark Carter keeping that notebook in a kitchen drawer for 25 years without opening it. And she thought about Lily sitting in the kitchen on the morning of October 3rd, writing in it, while her father asked her to eat something before lunch. And she thought about Emma Carter, 12 years old, in the dark of that room, sitting beside her brother and saying his name into the silence. Then she opened her laptop and returned to the property records for the Riverside Theater in 1998. The theater had been undergoing partial renovation of its mechanical systems in late 1997 and early 1998. New electrical panels, updated fire suppression infrastructure. The contractor was a company called Cascade Interior Works out of Roseburg. Miller had already requested their personnel records. Now she searched specifically for any overlap between the renovation crew and the name Daniel Brooks. The records arrived by email that evening. Daniel Brooks, licensed electrician, had worked on the Riverside Theater renovation from November 1997 through April 1998. His license had been issued by the state of Oregon in 1993. His address of record was a rental property on Clover Road in Willow Creek. Miller looked up the property. Currently owned by a family named Peterson. Sold in August 1998, 10 months after the children disappeared. She pulled Brooks's vehicle registration, a 1994 Ford pickup. Registration lapsed in September 1998. She pulled his tax records, filed through 1997. Nothing after. She pulled his medical history through an emergency court subpoena and found what she had half expected. In February 1998, Daniel Brooks had been admitted involuntarily to the Oregon State Hospital in Salem following a breakdown, reported by a coworker who found him in the parking lot of a grocery store in Roseburg, disoriented and unable to identify himself. He had been held for 96 days. He had been released in June 1998. Miller did the math quickly. The children had disappeared October 3rd, 1998. Brooks had been committed in February, 4 months before the disappearance. That meant the children were taken after his release, but it also meant the room had been constructed months earlier, during the renovation, and whatever logic had driven him to build it had been building during his hospitalization, not preceding it. She called the Oregon State Hospital Records Office and requested everything they had on Brooks's 1998 admission. Then she drove back to the Carter house on Sycamore Street, alone, with a flashlight and a copy of the 1962 municipal infrastructure map she'd pulled from the county records office that afternoon. The map showed what she needed: an original underground utility conduit network, installed when the historic district was built in the early 1960s, running beneath the basements of several connected properties, including the Riverside Theater and 3 residential buildings on the adjacent block. One of those residential buildings was 14 Sycamore Street. She knocked on Mark Carter's door at 9 in the evening. He answered in a flannel shirt, his face with the hollowed look of a man who had not slept since her call 2 days before. He stepped back without being asked and let her in. "I need to look at your basement," she said. He nodded. He led her downstairs without speaking. The basement was used for storage and a water heater.
In the corner, behind a metal shelving unit that Mark had to help her move, the flashlight found what she had driven here, hoping not to find. A section of the concrete block foundation wall that didn't match the surrounding construction. The blocks here were slightly newer, their mortar lighter in color, filling an opening that the original wall had not had. Miller pressed her hand against the blocks and felt the faint give of a fill rather than original construction. She photographed it and called the forensic team. The blocks came out the next morning.
Behind them was a narrow passage, 42 inches wide, lined with old electrical conduit housing that had been gutted to create the space. It ran northeast, under the yard, under the street, and after 60 feet, it connected to a branch of the old utility corridor that ultimately passed beneath the Riverside Theater. He had walked into the house through a passage he had built months in advance, in a corridor that existed on a map in a county records office, and he had walked 3 children out of their home and into a room he had been constructing for months while the town went about its ordinary life around him. He had locked the door from the inside on his way out, because the passage lock he'd installed operated from below. He had left the house exactly as it was. He had left the television on. Daniel Brooks was located in a residential care facility in Grants Pass, Oregon, on a Tuesday morning in late October 2023. He was 59 years old. He had been living under the name Daniel Ware since 1999, a fact established through fingerprints matched to his 1998 psychiatric records. He had worked as a handyman, a groundskeeper, and, most recently, a maintenance worker at the care facility itself. He had lived quietly. He had not drawn attention to himself. He had, as far as the staff could tell, been a reliable and unremarkable employee for 4 years. When Miller arrived with 2 agents from the FBI Portland field office, Brooks was in the facility's maintenance room, replacing a light switch. He turned around when the door opened and saw 3 people he didn't know, and something crossed his face that Miller had learned over 18 years to recognize. Not surprise and not defiance, but the specific expression of someone whose waiting has finally ended. He set down the screwdriver. He held up his hands without being asked. In the interview room at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, Brooks sat with a court-appointed attorney and answered Miller's questions in a flat, steady voice that suggested a man who had rehearsed this conversation internally for 25 years. He confirmed the passage under Sycamore Street, which he had worked on during the 1997 infrastructure assessment, disguising his modifications as part of the legitimate conduit work. He confirmed the hidden room in the Riverside Theater, built over 6 months during the renovation. He confirmed the children, what he had done and what he had intended, his voice never rising, never breaking, his hands folded on the table in front of him. "I was going to take them somewhere else," he said. "I had a property I'd found, outside of Eugene, remote, safe. I had a plan." "What happened to the plan?" Miller asked. "February," he said. "I had an episode. They found me and took me to the hospital. I was inside for 4 months. When they released me, I couldn't go back immediately. I needed time." He paused. "I thought they were still all right. I had left enough supplies for a week. I thought I would be back in days, not months." "You left 3 children in a sealed room with a week's worth of supplies," Miller said, keeping her voice level with the effort of someone pressing down on something with all their weight. "You were gone for 4 months." "I know," Brooks said. "I know what I did." He had returned to Willow Creek in July 1998. He had approached the theater at night. He had stood outside the maintenance corridor entrance for what he estimated was 2 hours. He had not opened the door. he had walked away. He had driven to Portland that night and then south to Grants Pass, and he had never returned to Willow Creek, not once. Not until the name Daniel Ware was printed on a name tag at a care facility 70 miles away. Miller asked him why he had taken the children. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that she wrote down word for word, because she needed to have it exactly right for the record. Needed it to be his words, and not her summary of them. "The world hurt children," he said. "I had seen it. I had seen what people did. I wanted to put them somewhere it couldn't reach them. I was going to give them a better life. I was going to give them everything. I just needed time to set it up properly." He looked at his folded hands. "I understood, later, that I was sick. I understood what I had done, but understanding it didn't change it." Miller closed her notebook. "Mark Carter has been in that house for 25 years, she said, waiting for an answer. Brooks looked up. It was the first time since the interview began that he met her eyes directly. Something in his face shifted, not into remorse exactly, but into the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a thing far too long. "I know," he said again. Miller stood, collected her materials, and left the interview room. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and stood there for a moment, with her eyes closed, feeling the specific weight of the building around her. The fluorescent hum, the distant sound of a door somewhere down the corridor, the cold, recycled air. She let herself feel all of it. Then she straightened up and walked to her car and drove to Willow Creek to see Mark Carter. The sentencing hearing for Daniel Brooks, 5 counts including 3 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of first-degree kidnapping, and 1 count of felony obstruction, was held in the Douglas County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in March 2024. Mark Carter sat in the front row with his ex-wife Carol on one side and his sister on the other. He had not seen Carol in 6 years. She had come without being asked, driving up from Medford the night before and calling him from the parking lot of the gas station on Route 9 to say she was there. He had gone out to meet her in the dark, and they had stood beside her car for a while without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. Brooks received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. He received the verdict without visible reaction. His attorney made a statement about mental illness and the failures of the system in 1998. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Helen Farr, presented Lily Carter's recovered diary entries, read aloud by a victim advocate into the silent courtroom. When the advocate read the final entry, "We stayed together the whole time." Mark Carter put his face in his hands. Carol reached over and held both of his hands in hers and did not let go. Miller attended the hearing from the back of the courtroom, as she usually did at hearings in cases she'd investigated. She left before the crowd dispersed, walking out into the March morning where rain was coming down with the specific Oregon persistence that was less precipitation than atmosphere, the air itself become water. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, her collar up, watching the rain move across the hills above town. Emma, Lily, and Noah Carter were buried in the Willow Creek Municipal Cemetery in February, a private ceremony that the family had asked the media to respect, and that the media, to their credit, largely did. 3 maple saplings were planted the following month at the site of the old Riverside Theater, which was being cleared for a town park. The park was scheduled to open in June. There would be benches and a path along the river, and a small bronze plaque with the children's names and a single sentence beneath them: "Beloved and looked for and found." Miller drove back to her apartment in Portland that evening.
She had 3 other cold case files open on her kitchen table, had been working them in parallel with the Carter case for months. She made coffee and sat down and looked at the files for a while without opening them.
She thought about Mark Carter's kitchen, the drawer beside the refrigerator where he'd kept Lily's notebook for 25 years. She had stood in that kitchen the day after the discovery and watched him open the drawer and look at the empty space where the notebook had been, the cloth still folded at the bottom. He hadn't said anything. He had just stood there, looking at the empty drawer, with one hand resting on its edge. She opened the top file on her stack. The name on the tab was Morrison, a boy, 8 years old, who had disappeared from a town in southern Oregon in 2009. The preliminary file was 40 pages. She'd read it twice. There was a detail on page 12 that had bothered her since the first read. A neighbor's statement that had been taken and filed and apparently never followed up on. A mention of a man who came to read the water meter on a schedule that didn't match the county utilities records. She turned to page 12 and began making notes. If you've made it this far, you already know that these stories don't end when the gavel comes down. They live in the files that nobody else would open, in the drawers people couldn't bring themselves to empty, in the details that got written down once in 1998 and never followed up on. If that's the kind of story that keeps you up at night, the same way it keeps us up, subscribe now. Every case we cover is chosen because someone deserves to be remembered, and because somewhere in the paperwork there is always a page 12. Don't miss what comes next. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Mark Carter. She set down her pen and read it. 3 words. "Thank you, Sarah." She set the phone back on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and kept reading, because this was what she did, had always done, would keep doing. She found the lost. She spoke for the people who could no longer speak for themselves. She opened the drawers that other people couldn't bring themselves to open, and she looked at what was inside. She was halfway down page 14 when she found the name of the water meter reader. Her pen stopped moving. The name was Daniel Ware. She stood up so fast, her chair scraped back and caught on the edge of the rug. The Morrison boy, 2009, Southern Oregon, 11 years after Willow Creek, 4 years before Brooks had taken the job at the care facility in Grants Pass. There was a town called Cedar Falls, 2 hours south of Portland, with an 8-year-old boy who had vanished from a locked house on a Tuesday afternoon, and a water meter reader who had visited that block 4 times in 6 weeks on a schedule no utility company could account for, and whose name was Daniel Ware. Miller's coffee was still warm on the table. Outside her window, Portland moved through its evening, completely unaware of what she was holding. She picked up her phone and pulled up the address for the Morrison family's house in Cedar Falls. Then she pulled up the satellite map and zoomed in on the block. She zoomed in further. In the backyard of the house directly behind the Morrison property, barely visible through the tree cover, there was a structure. Low, concrete, older than the house itself. What the county assessor's records would later identify as a utility outbuilding, constructed in 1961, ownership transferred 4 times, last registered to a holding company that had been dissolved in 2003. She was already reaching for her keys with one hand and her jacket with the other when she stopped. She looked at the satellite image for a long moment. The outbuilding was 40 feet from the Morrison family's back fence. It had 1 door and no windows. The door, even at satellite resolution, appeared to be padlocked from the outside. Tell us in the comments, did you see it coming? And if you didn't, what was the moment it hit you? Miller called the Cedar Falls Police Department. It rang twice before someone picked up. "This is Detective Sarah Miller with Oregon State Police Cold Case Division," she said. "I need you to send someone to an address right now, tonight, and I need them to bring bolt cutters. I'll explain on the way. Please go now." She was in her car before they confirmed they were moving. The rain had stopped. The streets outside her apartment were quiet and wet and completely ordinary. And somewhere in Cedar Falls, 2 hours south, behind a family's backyard fence, a padlocked door was sitting in the dark exactly where it had been sitting for 15 years. And Miller pressed the accelerator down and drove toward it as fast as the city would let her.